Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined on set by criminal defense attorney Dan Hochheiser, and we're going to break down the biggest legal issues and stories in the news today. A bunch of things to cover, so let's get started. Right now, though, we will have to talk about the verdict that we have for you in the infamous Hollywood Ripper trial out of California. Michael Gargiulo had been on trial since May 2nd for the murders of 2 women and the attack on a third. He's also been implicated in the murder of another woman out in Illinois. These are crimes that spanned a 26-year period. Gargiulo has been characterized as a serial predator of women who systematically picked out his victims, even living near them. The defense was very keen to criticize the state's case, citing a lack of DNA evidence and even suggesting that there were alternative suspects that were overlooked. This trial, it's gained notoriety from a number of reasons, not just from the heinous nature of the attacks, but the celebrity aspect as well. As you may know, actor Ashton Kutcher testified earlier on in this trial that he was acquaintances with one of the victims, Ashley Ellerin, at the time of her death, and he had even visited her home on the night in question. While the defense denies that their client murdered Ellerin as well as Maria Bruno, in their closings they did admit he did in fact break into the home of one of the victims, but attributed that incident to something called dissociative amnesia. Well, after 4 days of deliberations, so he was found guilty of those 2 counts of murder and also the attempted murder. It now moves into the penalty phase, which begins on Tuesday, and the death penalty is on the table. The question that this jury will have to wrestle with is whether or not he was sane at the time of these attacks. So, Dan, are you surprised by this verdict? This jury was deliberating for several days. We weren't sure which way it was going to go, and the state's case was questioned in a way. They were able to point evidence that he was there in the attempted attack, the attempted murder of one of the victims, but not so much the murders of these other 2 women. We weren't sure which way it was going to go. Were you surprised?
Well, I don't know that surprise is the right word, but this was certainly a case where you had plenty of circumstantial evidence, and anytime you have a circumstantial case, there's always a chance for the defense to win the case, which was the case here. It didn't happen. He was convicted. But the real question I have before we get into the penalty phase is what's going to happen during this sanity phase. Is he going to be found suitable to sit for the penalty phase? That's
the part that I'm confused about. If you have a defense where your defense is he didn't do it, and then you move into the penalty phase and you're saying, well, jury, okay, we'll take your opinion that he did it. We'll take your verdict that he did it. So now let's explain why he did it. Doesn't those 2 ideas conflict?
They do, but I don't see why you can't argue that assuming the jury's verdict is accurate for the sake of that proceeding, the question is, did he understand the nature of his actions, of the killings, and did he understand the nature of the consequences of his actions such that he knew what he was doing was wrong? There are people who are insane, who are not right in the head, who hear voices, who think they're driven to commit these heinous crimes by all kinds of crazy things going on in their own minds. And I think that's what the court has to determine first before we get to the question of should the jury vote to kill this man.
Well, the jury had a lot to consider, and they're going to have a lot to consider. One of the things that they did think about is the prosecution's closing argument, where they tied all of these facts together. So let's play a little bit of the prosecution's closing argument from the other day. Dan, this was an interesting case for the prosecution. One of the things that they were allowed to do was bring in evidence of a murder from a different state to try to show that this was a pattern here. They had multiple victims, multiple time frames. What do you think it's like prosecuting a case just like this?
Well, when you have a judge who permits you to bring in prior bad act evidence of an uncharged crime, it's a huge advantage for the prosecution, because now they can show that there was no mistake, that this is the person's signature crime, this is their modus operandi. So that really gives the prosecutor a big advantage over the defense. We saw that in remember the Bill Cosby prosecution, where the prosecution in that trial was allowed to introduce all those other uncharged sex acts for these other women. That really destroyed the Cosby defense and led to his conviction, in my opinion. And so here you have a little taste of that same principle about the prior bad acts.
We've seen it happen on other trials that we've covered here on the network. I guess the question is, he's most likely going to be extradited to Illinois to face the separate trial, the separate charge of the murder of Trisha Pacascio back in 1993. How does this verdict affect that trial?
Well, there will be what we call motions in limine prior to the start of that trial, which the defense will seek to exclude as much information about this case as they can in that case, saying that it's unduly prejudicial.
But the jury can't know in that Illinois trial that he's just been convicted in Los Angeles? They won't be able to know that?
Well, they shouldn't be able to know that unless the prosecution can come up with some other reason to introduce the evidence besides to show that this defendant has a propensity to commit murder.
Right.
Because we don't want to convict a person in America for killing one person because they killed another person. Even if you think they're a terrible person, you're presumed innocent in every single trial, and we don't want to convict people based on their propensity to commit crimes. We want to convict them based upon evidence beyond a reasonable doubt they committed the particular crime.
That's great. That's a really strong legal argument. The other argument is that this guy is different from all the rest, and that the way they were actually able to tie him to the murders of these two women is because of the attempted murder of a surviving victim and his DNA from that crime scene. And isn't that the interesting question here? It's that the evidence against him for the murders wasn't that strong, but if they're able to tell a story of him living near these women, what are you going to cite it as? Just coincidence that he lived near these women who were ultimately brutally murdered? And I think, isn't there something to be said that this is that kind of 1 in a million case where you really can talk about all of this different kind of evidence because it does show him as a serial killer?
The prosecution is for sure going to argue, Judge, in order to give the jury context and background to understand why the investigators did what they did, we have to introduce the prior information about these other crimes because they're inextricably interwoven, and this case won't make sense without the prior information.
And that's probably what they're going to do out in Illinois, and we're going to wait and see what happens. But first, we have to talk more about this verdict. We're going to take a break. Stay tuned.